The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial red tunic for what he believed would be another routine day of royal duty. At 28 years old, James had served as a member of the Queen's Guard for 6 years, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and dignitaries passed by. His polished boots gleamed, his bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his expression remained as stoic as the ancient stones surrounding him. The castle buzzed with its usual morning energy. Staff members hurried between buildings carrying silver trays and important documents, while groundskeepers tended to the pristine gardens that had welcomed royalty for nearly 1,000 years. James had witnessed countless memorable moments during his service, from state visits by world leaders to intimate family gatherings, but nothing had prepared him for what would unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday. Prince George, now 11 years old and third in line to the throne, had always been different from other royal children James had observed over the years. Unlike his younger siblings, who often displayed typical childhood exuberance, George carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed far beyond his years. The young prince possessed an unusual awareness of the people around him, often noticing details that escaped even the most observant adults. As James took his position near the main entrance, he noticed the familiar figure of Prince George walking across the courtyard with his tutor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. The boy wore his school uniform beneath a navy coat, his blonde hair neatly combed and his posture reflecting the royal training he had received since he could walk. What struck James most about the young prince was his eyes. They held a depth of understanding that seemed to see beyond the surface of everything around him. The morning proceeded as expected, with James maintaining his rigid stance while various castle staff and visitors moved about their business. He had mastered the art of remaining perfectly still while keeping his awareness sharp, a skill that required years of training and discipline. His breathing was controlled, his gaze fixed straight ahead, and his mind focused on his duty to protect and represent the crown with unwavering dedication. Around mid-morning, James noticed Prince George had finished his tutorial session and was now walking alone through the courtyard. This was not unusual, as the young prince often took solitary walks around the castle grounds, apparently lost in thought or observation. What was different today was the way George seemed to be studying the guards stationed at various points around the complex. The prince approached slowly, his footsteps barely audible on the ancient cobblestones. James remained motionless, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded, but he could sense the boy's presence growing closer. In his peripheral vision, he could see Prince George stop directly in front of him, tilting his head slightly as if examining something fascinating. For several minutes, the young prince stood there in complete silence. James felt a strange tension building in the air, as if something significant was about to happen, though he could not have predicted what form it would take. The usual sounds of the castle continued around them. Footsteps echoing off stone walls, distant conversations, the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. But between the guard and the prince, a profound stillness had settled. Then, in a moment that would change everything, Prince George did something that had never happened in all of James's years of service. The 11-year-old boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Without saying a word, he carefully placed it at James's feet, ensuring it was positioned where the guard could see it clearly. The gesture lasted only seconds, but its impact was immediate and profound. James felt his trained composure waver for the first time in years. His eyes, which were supposed to remain fixed straight ahead, involuntarily glanced down at the paper. Prince George caught this subtle movement, and for just a moment their eyes met. In that brief exchange, James saw something in the young prince's expression that shook him to his core. It was not mischief or childish rebellion, but rather a deep compassion and understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young. The boy's eyes conveyed a message that words could never capture, an acknowledgement of James's humanity beneath the ceremonial uniform, a recognition of the person behind the duty. Prince George gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible to anyone who might be watching, before turning and walking away with the same quiet dignity he had displayed upon arrival. James watched the small figure disappear around a corner, his mind racing with questions and emotions he had never experienced while on duty. The folded paper remained at his feet, a tangible reminder of the extraordinary moment that had just occurred. James knew that reading it would require him to break protocol, to abandon his rigid stance and acknowledge the gift that had been placed before him. But something about Prince George's gesture had touched a part of his soul that years of military training had never quite suppressed. As the minutes passed, James found himself struggling with a decision that would test everything he believed about duty, protocol, and the invisible barriers that separated the royal family from those who served them. The simple piece of paper represented far more than just a message. It was a bridge across a gap that was never supposed to be crossed. The weight of the folded paper at his feet seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. James had faced enemy fire during his military service before joining the Queen's Guard, had stood unwavering through thunderstorms and scorching heat, but nothing had prepared him for the internal battle now raging within him. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to ignore the paper, to maintain his position and pretend the exchange had never happened. But Prince George's eyes haunted him. There had been something urgent in that brief glance, something that suggested this was far more than a childish prank or moment of royal whimsy. The 11-year-old had looked at him with the gravity of someone much older, someone who understood the significance of what he was doing. 20 minutes passed before James made his decision. During a brief moment when the courtyard was relatively empty, he quickly bent down and retrieved the paper, slipping it into his jacket pocket with movements so swift they were barely visible. His heart pounded as he resumed his rigid stance, acutely aware that he had just committed an act that could end his career if discovered. The remainder of his shift felt eternal. Every footstep that approached made him tense. Every supervisor who passed caused his pulse to quicken. He had never broken protocol before, not once in his 6 years of service, and the knowledge that he now carried Prince George's secret message felt both thrilling and terrifying. When his replacement finally arrived for the afternoon shift, James followed the standard procedure for changing of the guard with mechanical precision. He saluted, reported that all was well, and marched to the designated area where guards could relax between duties. Only when he was completely alone in a small room used by off-duty personnel did he dare to remove the paper from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat and careful, clearly that of someone who had been taught proper penmanship from an early age. The message was brief but powerful in its simplicity. I see you standing there every day and I know you must get tired. I brought you this because I thought you might be thirsty. There's a bottle of water hidden behind the third rose bush in the east garden. Thank you for protecting us, George. James stared at the words, reading them several times before their full meaning sank in. The young prince had not only noticed him as an individual rather than just another uniformed guard, but had also recognized his basic human needs. More remarkable still, George had taken the initiative to do something about it. Despite the enormous breach of protocol such an action represented, the thoughtfulness behind the gesture overwhelmed James. In a world where he was expected to be invisible, to blend into the background like a piece of furniture, Prince George had seen him as a person deserving of kindness and consideration. The boy had risked getting into serious trouble, with his handlers and tutors just to ensure that a guard might have access to water during his long shift. James carefully refolded the note and placed it back in his pocket. The smart thing to do would be to forget about the water, to pretend the entire incident had never occurred and return to his normal routine. But something deep inside him refused to let such an extraordinary act of kindness go unacknowledged. Against his better judgment, James found himself walking toward the east garden. The castle grounds were extensive, with multiple gardens designed by the finest landscape architects over several centuries. The east garden was one of the smaller, more intimate spaces, filled with carefully tended roses that bloomed in magnificent displays throughout the warmer months. He found the third rose bush easily enough, a particularly robust specimen with deep red blooms that released their fragrance into the afternoon air. Hidden behind it, exactly as Prince George had promised, was a small bottle of water. It was not just any water, but an expensive brand that James recognized from the royal household's preferred suppliers. As he picked up the bottle, James noticed another small piece of paper tucked underneath it. This note was even shorter than the first. I hope this helps. You do important work, and important work is hard. Or the simple acknowledgement of his service, written in a child's careful handwriting, moved James more than any commendation or medal he had ever received. Prince George had somehow understood that the hardest part of his job was not the physical demands or the constant vigilance. but the emotional toll of being treated as invisible day after day. James sat on a small stone bench in the garden, hidden from view by the surrounding foliage, and took a long drink of the water. It tasted sweeter than any beverage he had ever consumed, not because of its quality, but because of the kindness that had provided it. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly relax while on castle grounds, letting his shoulders drop and his breathing become natural. As he sat there, James began to understand that Prince George's gesture represented something far larger than a simple act of kindness. The boy was demonstrating qualities that would serve him well as a future king: empathy, thoughtfulness, and the ability to see beyond the rigid structures of royal protocol to the human beings who made the monarchy possible. But even as James appreciated the prince's remarkable character, he couldn't shake the feeling that accepting such gifts might somehow compromise his position. The invisible barriers between royalty and their servants existed for reasons that had been established over centuries of tradition. By crossing those barriers, even in such a small way, both he and Prince George were entering uncharted territory. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the garden when James finally stood to leave. He carefully disposed of the empty water bottle in a waste bin far from the rose bush, ensuring that no evidence of the exchange would remain. But as he walked back toward the main castle, he couldn't escape the profound sense that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of his role and his relationship to the royal family he served. Over the following days, James found himself changed by Prince George's simple act of kindness. Where once he had stood at his post with mechanical precision, now he was acutely aware of every person who passed by. He began to notice details he had previously ignored: the tired expression on a young maid's face as she hurried between duties, the way an elderly groundskeeper favored his left leg, the quiet sadness in a footman's eyes as he polished silver in the corridor. Prince George, for his part, seemed to go out of his way to walk past James's post each morning. The young prince never acknowledged him directly, maintaining the proper protocol expected of his position, but James could sense a subtle connection between them. Sometimes George would slow his pace slightly when passing, or glance in James's direction, with what might have been the hint of a smile. The secret they shared created an invisible bond that both thrilled and troubled James. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to remain completely neutral and detached while performing his duties. But now he found himself looking forward to seeing the young prince, wondering what thoughtful gesture might come next, and feeling a protective warmth toward the boy that went beyond his official responsibilities. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the first incident, Prince George approached James's post with his usual quiet dignity. This time, however, he was not alone. Walking beside him was his younger sister, Princess Charlotte, who was chattering excitedly about her art lesson. James noticed that George seemed distracted, frequently glancing in his direction with an expression of concern. As they drew closer, James could hear fragments of their conversation. Princess Charlotte was describing a painting she was working on, something involving horses and castles, but Prince George's responses were brief and somewhat absent-minded. When they reached the point directly in front of James's position, George suddenly stopped walking. "Charlotte," he said gently, "why don't you go ahead to the library? I'll catch up with you in a moment." The 6-year-old princess looked puzzled but obediently skipped away toward the main entrance, her blonde curls bouncing as she moved. George waited until she was out of sight before turning his full attention to James. For several long moments, the young prince studied the guard's face with an intensity that made James deeply uncomfortable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Prince George spoke directly to him for the first time. "You look different today," he said simply. "Sadder." The observation was so unexpected and so accurate that James nearly broke his stance entirely. The previous evening had brought news that his father, a retired police officer living in Yorkshire, had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition. James had spent most of the night lying awake, worrying about medical expenses and wondering if he should request leave to visit home. The stress and emotional turmoil had indeed left their mark on his face, despite his best efforts to maintain his professional composure. "I know you're not supposed to talk to me," George continued, his young voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "But I wanted you to know that if something is wrong, someone should care about that. Someone does care about that. The simple statement hit James like a physical blow. In his world of rigid protocol and invisible barriers, the idea that his personal struggles might matter to anyone, let alone a member of the royal family, had never occurred to him. He was trained to be a silent sentinel, a guardian whose own needs and feelings were irrelevant to his function. Prince George reached into his pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small gift card. He placed it carefully on the ground near James's feet, just as he had done with the first note. This time, however, he lingered for a moment longer, his young face showing a maturity that was both touching and slightly heartbreaking. "My grandmother always says that taking care of family is the most important duty anyone can have," George said softly. "Even more important than other kinds of duty." With that, the 11-year-old prince turned and walked away, leaving James standing frozen in place with tears threatening to spill from his eyes for the first time since childhood. The gift card lay at his feet like a small beacon of hope, and James knew without looking that it would be exactly what he needed most. When he was finally able to retrieve and examine the card during his break, James discovered it was a substantial gift certificate for a popular travel booking website, more than enough to cover train fare to Yorkshire and back. Attached to it was another brief note in George's careful handwriting. "Families need each other, especially when times are hard. Use this to be where you need to be. Your friend G." The word friend struck James with particular force. In his entire career, no member of the royal family had ever acknowledged him as anything more than a functional component of the castle's security apparatus. The idea that Prince George, third in line to the throne, would consider him a friend was both overwhelming and deeply humbling. But the gift also presented James with an enormous dilemma. Accepting such a generous present from a member of the royal family would be a serious breach of protocol, potentially grounds for immediate dismissal and loss of pension. The regulations were clear and absolute. Guards were forbidden from accepting any gifts or favors from the people they were sworn to protect, yet how could he reject such a thoughtful gesture from a child who had somehow recognized his pain and responded with genuine compassion? The gift was not offered out of condescension or obligation, but from a pure desire to help someone in need. To refuse it would feel like crushing something beautiful and innocent in George's character. As James sat in the small break room, staring at the gift card and note, he realized that Prince George had inadvertently created an impossible situation. The boy's kindness was forcing James to choose between his career and his conscience, between following rules and honoring the most generous act anyone had ever shown him. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine not only his future with the Queen's Guard, but also how he would remember this extraordinary child who had seen past his uniform to the struggling man beneath. James spent the entire night wrestling with his conscience. He walked the floors of his small apartment near the castle, holding Prince George's gift card and note in his hands, reading the words over and over again. The generosity of the gesture warred with the severity of accepting it, creating a moral battle that left him exhausted and confused. By morning, he had reached a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting the gift, James chose a third option that he hoped would honor both Prince George's kindness and his own professional obligations. He would speak to his commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, and tell him everything. Captain Hayes was a stern man in his 50s who had served with distinction in the military before joining the royal household. He was known for his unwavering adherence to protocol and his intolerance for any behavior that might compromise the security or dignity of the royal family. James had never spoken to him about anything beyond the most basic operational matters, and approaching him with such an unprecedented situation felt like walking into a minefield. James requested a private meeting, which was granted immediately due to the unusual nature of the request. In Captain Hayes's small office, surrounded by photographs of various royal ceremonies and commendations, James laid out the entire story. He showed the captain both notes and the gift card, explaining every detail of his interactions with Prince George while bracing himself for the inevitable consequences. Captain Hayes listened in complete silence, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When James finished his account, the captain sat back in his chair and stared at the evidence spread across his desk. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally spoke. "In 32 years of service to this family," Captain Hayes said slowly, "I have never heard anything quite like this. Prince George has put you in an impossible position, though I suspect he doesn't fully understand the implications of his actions." James nodded, feeling a mixture of relief at having shared the burden and terror at what would come next. He had expected immediate dismissal, perhaps even criminal charges for accepting gifts from a member of the royal family. Instead, Captain Hayes seemed to be considering the situation from multiple angles. "What exactly do you want me to do with this information, Sergeant Mitchell?" the captain asked. "Are you reporting this because you want the prince to be disciplined for his behavior, or are you seeking permission to accept his gifts?" The question caught James off guard. He had assumed that reporting the incidents would automatically result in punishment for both him and Prince George, but Captain Hayes seemed to be offering him choices he hadn't expected. "Neither, sir," James replied carefully. "I wanted to be honest about what happened because keeping it secret felt wrong. But I also can't bear the thought of getting Prince George in trouble for showing kindness to someone he thought needed help." Captain Hayes picked up the gift card and examined it closely. "This is worth more than you make in a month, Sergeant. The prince has access to resources that could easily seem like bribery or corruption to outside observers. The regulations exist for very good reasons. I understand that, sir. But this wasn't bribery. It was just a child trying to help someone he thought was suffering. And that," Captain Hayes said with a slight smile, "is exactly the problem. Prince George's instincts are admirable, but his methods are completely inappropriate for someone in his position. He needs to understand the consequences of his actions, not just for you, but for the monarchy itself." James felt his heart sink. Despite his hope that somehow both he and Prince George might escape punishment, it seemed that the captain was preparing to take official action that would end both his career and the prince's innocent attempts at kindness. Captain Hayes stood and walked to his window, looking out at the courtyard where James had first encountered Prince George's surprising gesture. After a long moment, he turned back to James with an expression that was both thoughtful and slightly mischievous. "I'm going to do something that goes against every protocol manual ever written," he announced. "I'm going to arrange for you to have a private conversation with Prince George. Not as a guard receiving orders from royalty, but as two human beings who need to understand each other." The suggestion was so unexpected that James was certain he had misheard. "Sir, I don't think that's possible." The protocols, Captain Hayes interrupted, were written to handle normal situations. This is not a normal situation. Prince George has already crossed every line that exists between royalty and staff. The question now is whether we can guide him toward more appropriate ways of expressing his natural compassion, or whether we simply shut him down entirely and risk damaging something beautiful in his character. James stared at his commanding officer, struggling to process what he was hearing. The idea of having a real conversation with Prince George, of being able to thank him properly for his kindness, while also explaining why such gestures were dangerous, seemed both wonderful and terrifying. "What would I say to him?" James asked. "How could I possibly explain the complexity of this situation to an 11-year-old? "You'll figure it out," Captain Hayes replied with confidence. "You're both good people who care about doing the right thing. Sometimes that's enough to bridge any gap, even the one between a future king and a guard." As Captain Hayes began making arrangements for the unprecedented meeting, James realized that Prince George's simple acts of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, protocol, and the invisible barriers that defined his world. The conversation that lay ahead would determine whether the bond between them could survive the harsh realities of royal life, or whether it would become just another casualty of the ancient rules that governed their very different worlds. The arranged meeting took place in a small sitting room that James had never entered during his 6 years of service. The space was elegant but comfortable, with soft lighting and furniture that seemed designed for intimate conversations rather than formal ceremonies. Captain Hayes had somehow managed to clear 30 minutes in Prince George's schedule, explaining to the boys' handlers that it was a brief security consultation that required privacy. James arrived first, his dress uniform impeccably pressed but his hands trembling slightly with nervous energy. He had rehearsed various opening statements during the sleepless hours before the meeting, but none of them seemed adequate for such an extraordinary situation. How did one address a future king who had shown such unexpected kindness? What tone should he take with a child who had demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years? Prince George entered the room with his characteristic quiet dignity, but James immediately noticed a change in his demeanor. The boy seemed smaller somehow, less confident than he had appeared during their brief encounters in the courtyard. His eyes, usually so direct and penetrating, now showed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Please sit down, Your Royal Highness," James began, gesturing toward one of the comfortable chairs. "Actually," Prince George replied softly, "could you just call me George? If we're going to talk like real people, we should probably sound like real people." The simple request broke much of the tension James had been feeling. Here was the same thoughtful child who had noticed his struggles and responded with compassion, now asking to be treated as an equal despite the vast differences in their stations. "George," James began again, settling into his own chair, "I wanted to thank you for your kindness, but I also need to help you understand why what you did was both wonderful and dangerous." The young prince leaned forward intently, clearly prepared to listen with the same serious attention he brought to his formal education. "Did I get you in trouble? I was worried about that." "Not in the way you might think," James replied carefully, "but your gifts created a situation that could have ended my career if I had handled it differently. There are rules about guards accepting anything from the royal family, rules that exist to protect both of us." George's face fell slightly. "I didn't know about those rules. I just saw that you looked sad and tired, and I wanted to help. My mother always says that when we see someone who needs help, we should try to do something about it." "Your mother is absolutely right," James assured him quickly, "and your instincts were perfect. The problem isn't that you wanted to help. It's that your position makes even simple acts of kindness complicated." For the next several minutes, James explained the complex web of protocols and regulations that governed interactions between royalty and their staff. He talked about the historical reasons for these barriers, the way they protected both sides from accusations of favoritism or corruption, and the delicate balance that kept the entire system functioning. Prince George listened with remarkable maturity, asking occasional questions that showed he was grasping concepts that many adults would find difficult to understand. When James finished his explanation, the boy sat quietly for a moment, processing everything he had heard. "So I can't be friends with the people who work here?" George asked finally, his voice carrying a note of sadness that broke James's heart. "It's not that simple," James replied. "You can appreciate them, respect them, and care about their well-being. But the ways you show that caring have to be different from how you might treat school friends or family members." "That seems lonely," George observed with startling insight. "For both of us." The comment revealed a depth of understanding that took James by surprise. Prince George had not only grasped the practical implications of the rules, but had also intuited their emotional cost. The boy understood that the barriers designed to protect the monarchy also isolated its members from meaningful connections with the people who dedicated their lives to serving it. "It can be lonely sometimes," James admitted, "but it's also an honor. Taking care of your family, protecting the institution you'll someday lead. These are responsibilities that matter more than personal friendships." Prince George was quiet for a long moment, his young face showing the kind of serious consideration that suggested he was wrestling with ideas far beyond his years. When he spoke again, his words carried a weight that reminded James he was talking to a future king. "What if there were other ways to show that I notice people and care about them? Ways that wouldn't break the rules or get anyone in trouble?" The question sparked something in James's mind. Perhaps the solution wasn't to shut down George's natural compassion, but to channel it in more appropriate directions. The boy's instincts were fundamentally sound. What he needed was guidance on how to express them within the constraints of his position. "Tell me what you're thinking," James encouraged. "Well," George began thoughtfully, "what if I ask my grandmother to make sure that the guards have proper rest areas and water stations? Or what if I learned the names of the people who work here, so I could acknowledge them properly when we pass? Those things wouldn't be gifts or special favors. They would just be good management." James felt a surge of admiration for the boy's quick thinking. Prince George had identified ways to address the human needs he had observed, while working entirely within the system, rather than around it. His suggestions showed both political sophistication and genuine concern for the well-being of others. "Those are excellent ideas," James told him sincerely. "They show real leadership, the kind that will serve you well when you're king." Prince George smiled for the first time since entering the room, but then his expression grew serious again. "What about your father? You still look worried about something." The observation reminded James that his original crisis remained unresolved. Prince George's gift card still sat in Captain Hayes's desk, unusable due to protocol but desperately needed for practical reasons. That situation is complicated, James admitted. But you've already helped more than you know, just by showing that someone cared enough to notice. The young prince studied James's face with the same intensity he had shown in the courtyard, and James could practically see the wheels turning in his remarkable mind. Whatever Prince George was planning next, James suspected it would be both surprising and perfectly executed. 3 days after their conversation, James was surprised to receive a formal summons to report to the private secretary's office. Such requests were highly unusual for ordinary guards, typically reserved for matters involving serious disciplinary action or significant changes in duty assignments. James's stomach churned as he made his way through the castle's corridors, wondering if Prince George had somehow gotten him into even deeper trouble, despite their apparent understanding. The private secretary, Mr. Edmund Thornbury, was a distinguished man in his 60s who had served the royal household for over 2 decades. His office was filled with leather-bound books and official documents, creating an atmosphere of scholarly authority that made James feel distinctly out of place. Mr. Thornbury looked up from his desk with an expression that was both businesslike and slightly puzzled. "Sergeant Mitchell," he began without preamble, "I have received a rather unusual request that appears to originate from Prince George, though it has been channeled through proper administrative channels. It seems His Royal Highness has become concerned about the welfare provisions for castle security staff." James felt his heart skip a beat. Prince George had clearly taken their conversation to heart and was already working to implement the changes they had discussed. But the formal nature of this meeting suggested something much larger than simple policy adjustments. "The prince has submitted a detailed proposal," Mr. Thornbury continued, holding up several pages of what appeared to be carefully researched documentation. "He suggests implementing regular health and wellness checks for all security personnel, improved rest facilities, and emergency assistance funds for staff facing personal crises." The scope of Prince George's proposal astounded James. The boy had not only remembered their conversation, but had expanded upon it, creating a comprehensive system that would benefit all castle employees rather than addressing individual cases. The political sophistication required to navigate the administrative channels while maintaining appropriate protocol was remarkable for someone so young. "What's particularly interesting," Mr. Thornbury added with a slight smile, "is that Prince George has requested to fund these initiatives from his own allowance and future inheritance. He's prepared to make a substantial personal investment in the well-being of the staff." James struggled to process what he was hearing. Prince George had somehow transformed his simple act of kindness into a formal policy proposal that would help countless people while avoiding all the ethical complications of direct gifts. The boy had found a way to express his compassion through the existing power structures, rather than working around them. "The Queen has reviewed the proposal," Mr. Thornbury continued, "and she's quite impressed with both its thoughtfulness and its practical implementation. She's approved the initiative and has asked that it be expanded to all royal residences." The implications of what Prince George had accomplished began to sink in. His innocent desire to help one struggling guard had evolved into a royal welfare program that would improve conditions for hundreds of employees. The boy had turned a potential scandal into a model of enlightened leadership. "There is, however, one specific element of the proposal that requires your input," Mr. Thornbury said, his tone becoming more personal. "Prince George has requested that the Emergency Assistance Fund be used to help staff members facing family health crises. He specifically mentioned that such assistance should be available immediately, without lengthy approval processes that might delay critical care." James realized that Prince George had found a way to address his father's medical situation without directly violating any protocols. The assistance would come through official channels as part of a broader welfare program, removing any appearance of impropriety while still providing the help that was desperately needed. "If you have any family members requiring medical attention," Mr. Thornbury said carefully, "you should know that applications for emergency assistance can be processed immediately under the new program." The private secretary's tone made it clear that he understood exactly what was happening. Prince George had briefed the administrative staff sufficiently to ensure that James's specific needs would be met. while maintaining the appearance of routine bureaucratic process. "Thank you, sir," James managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I may indeed need to submit such an application. The forms will be available this afternoon," Mr. Thornberry replied with professional efficiency. "I'm told that travel expenses for family emergencies are considered high priority under the new guidelines." As James left the office, his mind reeled with the implications of what Prince George had accomplished. The 11-year-old had demonstrated political skills that many adult leaders would envy, turning a personal moment of compassion into lasting institutional change. He had solved James's immediate crisis while creating a system that would help others facing similar challenges for years to come. But perhaps most remarkably, Prince George had done all of this without taking personal credit or seeking recognition. The proposal had been submitted through proper channels, reviewed by appropriate authorities, and approved based on its merits rather than its royal sponsorship. The boy had learned to wield his influence responsibly, using it to create positive change rather than simply getting his own way. That evening, as James filled out the emergency assistance application that would allow him to visit his ailing father, he realized that his encounter with Prince George had changed both of them in profound ways. The young prince had learned important lessons about leadership and responsibility, while James had gained a new understanding of the potential for compassion within the rigid structures of royal life. The application was approved within hours, a speed that would have been impossible under the old system. As James packed for his journey to Yorkshire, he carried with him not just the means to help his father, but also a renewed sense of purpose in his role as protector of a family that had shown him such unexpected humanity. Word of the new welfare program spread quickly through the castle staff, generating a buzz of appreciation and respect for the young prince who had championed their cause. James noticed that other guards now looked at Prince George with a new understanding, recognizing him not just as a future monarch to be protected, but as a leader who genuinely cared about their well-being. 6 months later, James stood at his familiar post in the castle courtyard, but everything had changed. The new welfare program had transformed the working conditions for all castle staff, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect and care that permeated every corner of the ancient building. Rest areas had been upgraded, health monitoring systems implemented, and most importantly, a culture of compassion had taken root throughout the royal household. James had spent 2 weeks with his father in Yorkshire, using the emergency assistance to help cover medical expenses and provide the emotional support his family desperately needed. The experience had reminded him why his service to the crown mattered, not just as a job, but as part of a larger mission to protect an institution that could genuinely make a positive difference in people's lives. Upon his return, James discovered that his story had become something of a legend among the castle staff, though the details remained carefully guarded to protect Prince George's privacy. Many employees now understood that the young prince was not just a symbol of future monarchy, but a real person who cared deeply about the people around him. Prince George continued his morning walks through the courtyard, but their interactions had evolved into something entirely appropriate and professionally sustainable. When the prince passed James's post, he would offer a slight nod of acknowledgement, nothing more than what protocol allowed, but James could see the warmth and genuine friendship in the boy's eyes. The change in Prince George himself was equally remarkable. The 11-year-old carried himself with new confidence, having learned that true leadership meant finding ways to help others within the proper channels rather than circumventing them entirely. His tutors reported that he showed increased interest in constitutional law and public administration, apparently eager to understand how governmental systems could be used to serve the common good. Captain Hayes had also been transformed by the experience. The stern officer who had once viewed any deviation from protocol as a serious threat now encouraged his guards to report situations where the welfare program might be needed. He had become an advocate for the staff, working closely with the administrative offices to ensure that Prince George's vision was implemented effectively across all royal properties. The success of the welfare program had attracted attention from other organizations, both within and outside the royal household. Several government agencies had requested information about the implementation process, hoping to adapt similar programs for their own employees. Prince George's simple act of kindness had inadvertently created a model for compassionate leadership that was spreading far beyond the castle walls. On this particular morning, as James took his position for what he knew would be his final shift at Windsor Castle, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a folded piece of paper placed at his feet. He had been accepted into an elite security training program that would advance his career significantly, an opportunity that became available partly due to the professional development initiatives included in Prince George's welfare program. As he stood at attention, James saw the familiar figure of Prince George approaching with his usual quiet dignity. The boy had grown taller over the past months, and his bearing showed the increasing confidence of someone learning to wield power responsibly. When he reached James's position, he paused for just a moment longer than usual. "Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell," Prince George said formally, but with unmistakable warmth in his voice. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James replied, maintaining perfect protocol while allowing his genuine affection for the remarkable young man to show in his tone. Prince George continued on his way, but not before giving James the same slight nod they had shared countless times over the past months. It was a small gesture, entirely appropriate and completely professional, but it carried the weight of everything they had experienced together, and the friendship that had developed within the proper boundaries of their respective roles. Later that afternoon, as James prepared to leave Windsor Castle for the last time as a member of the Queen's Guard, he found a final note waiting in his locker. Written in Prince George's careful handwriting, it read simply, "Thank you for teaching me that caring about people and following the rules don't have to be opposite things. Your friend always, G." James carefully folded the note and placed it in his wallet, next to the original messages that had started their extraordinary journey together. As he walked out of the castle gates, he carried with him not just memories of an exceptional experience, but also a profound sense of hope for the future of the monarchy. Prince George had shown that the next generation of royal leadership would be characterized by genuine compassion and innovative thinking, combined with deep respect for tradition and proper procedure. The boy's natural empathy, guided by appropriate wisdom and channels, had the potential to transform the relationship between the crown and the people it served. Years later, as James advanced in his security career and eventually became an instructor training new guards, he would often tell the story of the young prince who changed everything with a simple act of kindness. He never revealed Prince George's identity or the specific details, but the lesson remained clear. True leadership meant seeing the humanity in everyone and finding ways to honor that humanity within the structures that serve the greater good. The 11-year-old boy who had once placed a bottle of water behind a rose bush had learned to channel his compassion into lasting institutional change, proving that the future of the monarchy was in remarkably capable and caring hands.